It's once again a pleasure to be joined by our good friend, international correspondent David A. Andelman. You will find David on CNN. You will find him doing written pieces on USA, and you will also find him and his Twitter account, which I am a frequent reader of, at David Andelman. And David, first of all, pleasure. Good evening. How are you, my friend?
I'm well, or should I say I am, which is better than the contrary.
And as we were chatting before we went on, I made this laundry list up over Saturday, and I was starting to run off the page with all of the things that are, all the things taking place in the national and international environment. But I think I'd like to start here. If you can describe, I think we've probably talked the last time maybe 5 or 6 months ago, right at the onset or right at the top of the Trump administration. If you can describe in a couple of words what your gut reaction is to everything that's taken place, what would you tell us?
Chaos. I guess that's the best thing. Look, the biggest problem is that, and I've talked about this, I think, on your show, and I've talked about it elsewhere. Trump doesn't have a worldview, and that's the worst thing for a president not to have. A president's got to have, Henry Kissinger used to describe it as Weltanschauung, which is the German translation of worldview, and he said the greatest presidents have always had that. They have a very good sense when they come to power, when they come into office, where they want the world to be when they leave office. And, obviously events dictate to a certain degree what goes on, and what their responses have to be. But they always have their eye on what the end point should be. They always have their eye on a world that they can shape in some fashion by their actions. And if they don't have that worldview, all they simply do is ping-pong from crisis to crisis, from event to event. And it's events then and crises that drive themselves and their presidencies. And there's no real sense of what the world is going to look like, and it usually winds up worse than when they started. So my fear is that we're already, even basically 7 months into his administration, we're driving pell-mell down that road at breakneck speed, not knowing what's around the next bend.
That's what I thought you would say, and believe me, in my perspective, it's a forced giggle. Of course, the biggest thing right now is the whole North Korea incident, and the little calming today in the markets. Hopefully, cooler heads are prevailing. We're not sure. What is your sense of this, and can the North Korean leadership consider, or are they considering, to sell nuclear weapons?
Well, look, I think right now the best we could hope for is some concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. That was what secured the peace during the entire Cold War.
Right.
The sense that we have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear weapons. Neither one of us wants to use it because it will mean the end of life on our planet, certainly the end of most functioning life in their country. So they simply sit there, and they don't have them. So I think we basically have to become resigned to the fact that North Korea is going to have a nuclear arsenal. And we have to figure out a way of living with that. There are already nuclear weapons in quite a number of other countries, not only in not United States and Russia, but half of the NATO countries, Britain, France, they all have nuclear weapons. Israel has a nuclear weapon. They don't acknowledge it. Pakistan and India each have a nuclear arsenal, and somehow we found a way to make it. Now, fortunately, thank God, Trump has not torn up the Iranian nuclear agreement, or we would have potentially two rogue nuclear states, neither of which is necessarily a signatory of the non-proliferation agreement, i.e., doesn't allow their weapons to be cataloged and monitored. So I think the best thing we can hope for is some kind of a is also going to destroy his country. And if that's the case, perhaps he will be able to keep it under lock and key sufficiently so it doesn't fall into the hands of the next terrorist with a satchel full of dollars or Swiss francs.
You mentioned an interesting point in your response about Trump keeping the deal with Iran. And my understanding is he originally, now you can correct me if I'm wrong and please do, he originally wanted to tear it up and negotiate a new one, but right. Then cooler heads prevailed, and I believe you had mentioned that the last thing we'd want to see happen is some disgruntled country running around with a nuclear weapon, and they felt that they got the short end of the stick.
Right. Well, in fact, what I was told, and in fact I wrote this on USA Today in one of my columns earlier this year, was that the Israelis, who had originally wanted him to tear it up, now recognize that would not be such a good idea, largely because Netanyahu's generals have told him they are not in a position to interdict the Iranian nuclear arsenal to the point where they could make sure that Iran would not produce an atomic weapon in the not-too-distant future. So basically, it's in the interest of the United States, it's in the interest of Israel, it's in the interest of most of the Middle East, and in fact, much of the world, that Iran doesn't get its hand on a nuclear weapon for at least another decade, which is what, and perhaps more longer than that, but at least a decade, which is what this nuclear agreement proposes and provides. And so far, they are, in fact, honoring the terms of this agreement, and that is being monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a UN body, and has managed to get in and observe the nuclear facilities in Iran to make sure that they're not in any sense trying to break out of this agreement. So it's working, and we got another 10 years, at least another decade, when hopefully we won't welcome another rogue state to the world of the nuclear states.
It's when you actually start to study it, it becomes quite chilling, and I thank you for your explanation on that. Bringing it now a little bit closer to home. Most recently, we've had these horrible demonstrations and occurrences. Last night, Seattle. What I'm hearing this weekend in Boston, then in Charlottesville, Virginia, and finally Trump comes out and denounces it. Some say after the fact. Others said he should have been there more frequently. Others said he shouldn't have done anything at all. This is disconcerting to me. I'm sure it's disconcerting to you and to others. Where do you think this boils up in terms of everything else in, shall we say, Trump land?
Well, it's just an indication of the kind of administration this is, I'm afraid. It's an administration that is supported by people that I don't necessarily agree at all with, and that I abhor. It's also it espouses some things that I also don't agree with at all, and it's really unfortunate. What is particularly unfortunate, though, from my perspective as an international journalist, is what it's doing to our image abroad, and especially in Europe, where Nazism is still, believe it or not, quite fresh in the minds of at least second and third generation after the Nazi scourge went across, almost destroyed Europe in the Second World War. There are still people in Germany, for instance, in fact, Germany itself has outlawed, and indeed it is a crime, to give a Nazi salute, to show any Nazi symbol or anything of the kind. Same is true in Switzerland and France and a number of other countries like that. So when they look at the United States and they see all of this happening, and they see a president who appears in some fashion, if not to condone it, at least not to condemn it wholeheartedly and instantly, that really destroys our ability. Again, it eats away. It eats away at our image and the image of our president in so many parts of the world that are important for us.
It's quite a. I'm just very troubled about that, and again, thank you for your perspective. When you start to move away, I'm sorry. Please continue.
No, go ahead. I'm clearing my throat.
Oh, okay. What I wanted to, moving from that, when we start to move to a little bit to the domestic and the international side, I know you were a fan of John Kerry, and you had given me your reasons for that, and I thought that was quite interesting. What is your sense of Rex Tillerson? Doing better, or a CEO out of place?
Well, I think he hasn't really proven himself yet, and I'm concerned about what he's doing to the State Department. I have to say that.
Yeah.
I think he's trying to run the State Department like Exxon, and that doesn't work. You can't bring in management consultants to look at an organogram that's the State Department and say, this is how it should work in a perfect universe. It's an organization that deals with intangibles very often. It's not producing anything. It's not trying to sell something, except perhaps the American image abroad. And it doesn't have a marketing department. Well, it sort of does. In fact, he's trying to destroy that. But it's not producing anything. In fact, it's producing ideas, or it should be producing ideas and concepts and carrying out a search for a better world or a democratic tradition and so on that we believe, things that we believe in. And he's just not doing a very good job in either staffing it or running it, for that matter. Mm-hmm. So I'm concerned about what's happening, and I'm concerned about the way a lot of Foreign Service officers are reflecting on this. I saw an interesting piece the other day saying that the numbers of applicants for some of the major schools that prepare people for the Foreign Service, like Georgetown and Fletcher at Tufts and so on, are way, way down. That people are not interested in a career anymore in the Foreign Service. At least, they haven't been in the past 6 or 8 months. So the next crop of Foreign Service officers may be extremely thin, and that's very disappointing.
When you think of it in those terms, you're absolutely correct. And when we start to talk about other Trump appointments, we had the comet that was known as Scaramucci, and was it the obscenity laced tirade that did him in, or did he have a disagreement with someone else on Trump's staff, or, as I was kidding with someone, that perhaps he screwed up the lunch order? I mean, I'm at a loss with this whole thing.
Well, I mean, it's pretty bizarre. It's pretty bizarre how we got there in the first place. But I think what happened was Trump began to realize that he was overstepping his bounds, and that he didn't seem to understand really that it was Trump who's in charge. And if Trump's going to be saying some of these things, he's the one who has to do it and act on it, and not his director of communications. So I think he did overstep his bounds, and I think he realizes that now. I don't know if your viewers saw him yesterday on Stephanopoulos, but he was a very, very much toned down Scaramucci. It's going to be very interesting to see him on Colbert tonight, Monday night at 11:30. I'm setting my DVR since I'm not usually up by that.
Yeah. Me neither.
But that should be interesting. Look, he's gone, and people. The word around town is that Bannon may not be too long either. For Steve Bannon for the as a top aide in the White House, simply because they have overstepped their bounds, and Trump realizes that he has to start getting his act together and get all the troops, singing out of the same hymnal, if you will. Now that he brought, a new chief of staff in who is a general and understands discipline and understands how to command and demand discipline, I think people like Bannon may have increasingly difficult times to do what they difficult tasks to do what they have been doing.
It's somehow I get the impression some days with Trump, he's running the country the way that George Steinbrenner ran the Yankees.
Right. Well, of course, he produced a lot of winners, George Steinbrenner. My wife is a big Yankees fan. I hate to say this, a Red Sox fan, but yeah, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be an interesting few months to see how Flynn fits in, how Kelly fits in, and whether he can keep some of these other forces at bay that have been trying to destroy their best to destroy the White House and Trump, for that matter.
And speaking of forces possibly destroying the White House, where in your estimation does this Mueller probe end up? It's increasing. Apparently, he's hiring more lawyers. Trump apparently is staying with two people, Cobb and Sekulow, not really kind of shrugging his shoulders, saying, "What me worry? I didn't do anything wrong." Are we sort of fit for a bombshell happening, or the possible firing of Mueller, or will it be a couple of slaps on the wrist, or maybe one person tossed over the side and life goes on?
Well, I can't see him firing Mueller at this point. That would just be
too obvious.
It would just be too much of a firestorm, given everything else that's going on at home and abroad. I think that would be just really catastrophic. What's possible? I have no idea what's going on there, and I really I'm as eager to watch the developments as you are, and I'm sure your listeners are. I suspect that there are going to be several people that go over the side. I think it's not impossible that he's doing his best to use Priebus and Manafort as a way of working his way up the food chain, perhaps. I'm sure they have certain things that they know have gone on, and if you can persuade them to, in return for immunity and for lighter treatment, could perhaps provide some interesting evidence for a future legal action. But beyond that, I really hate to say, because every time I predict something that's going on in this White House and it seems to be most reasonable, exactly the opposite happens. Completely irrational occurs. So I'm just hanging on for dear life and praying for the best.
It's amazing. Now, moving once again, coming back abroad, the Brexit debate, which seems to be, or the situation of Brexit, which seems to be unraveling by the moment, at least in my humble opinion, in Britain. But yet we have the ascendancy of France, which I thought, again, in my humble opinion, was a country in grave financial straits. Is the swing there going more liberal against a Trump-May type of perspective, or is it good management, perhaps, on the part of France?
Well, I think France has found itself a very good leader. I was skeptical at first about Macron, and I think he still has a long way to go. I think he has some major hurdles to get over. He has a lot of changes he wants to have made, and I'm not persuaded that necessarily he has an overwhelming majority in the French Parliament, which is good. But I don't think he's persuaded all of the other interest groups and power groups in France that his way is necessarily a way that will work well for all aspects of French society. And if he doesn't get the unions on board, there could very well be marches in the streets and demonstrations and so on that have brought down previous governments. So we're not there yet, but the initial prognosis is pretty good for the patient, and especially with Europe leaving the EU, there's a clear opening, a clear vacuum for France to step in, and I think that's what Macron is counting on, that he can lead France into a leadership position in the West. He's a young guy, he's visionary. France is not the basket case that Spain or Portugal or Italy have been, or Greece for that matter. So he has a good opportunity, I think, now. And Germany has Merkel. She's coming up as chancellor for her fourth re-election effort, and it's going to be interesting to see whether she's able to get the kind of strong support, I suspect she will, that she's been hoping for. So then we'll have two main power centers in Europe, which is France and Germany. Britain is out of it.
It's as I'm counting the balls here in the solar system, my head is starting to rock back and forth. It's just an amazing possibility tree. One thing I did want to discuss with you, leaning towards our closing moments together, We have this, of course, you have to be of a certain age to know what a Rubik's Cube is, but to the kids in the audience, it was a puzzle where you try to get four of a color on each side, and there was four cubes, and you got to look it up on Wikipedia. But the whole stalemate in our United States Senate about the taxes and the budget, and you can't do one without the other. Tie in healthcare, which of course has a direct tie to taxation due to the net investment income tax, and the failure to repeal and replace Obamacare with no real steam gathering in any of that. I mean, is this just a lost cause that comes back and hits the Republican Party in the head?
Well, I think there are a lot of lost causes that are going to hit the Republicans in the head, but the unfortunate thing is it could hit the Democrats equally hard. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. Because just remember, the Republican Party's failure can really also be laid by an adept politician at the door of the Democrats who stalemated them as well. So I'm a bit concerned that the Democrats have not really come up with a good answer to any of these problems. They've been obstructionists up until now, and that's not necessarily a very good position to be in 2018 when you have quite a number of Democratic senators who are being challenged for re-election in states that went for Donald Trump. So I'm concerned that the Republicans could solidify their hold over the Senate even more. I'm not going to predict that at all because it's a long time before fall of 2000.
Sure.
But it's something that troubles me that the Democrats still they've not solved their own left-right issues, just as the Republicans are also on the horns of that dilemma that they have these deep splits within their party, and that's one of the problems in Congress and the Senate right now is the Republican split along ideological lines. But the Democrats have those same problems, mm-hmm. and they've just been papered over by the need to provide some sort of a solid front, it would seem, against any Republican measure. That, again, a solid front of naysaying is not necessarily the best way to win the support of the broad mass of the American people.
It's certainly a deeply divided and pronounced split. For my last question for you, I'm going to play John McLaughlin and say, situation of the China and Russia friendship and its effect on things to come. Your thoughts, David Andelman.
Very important. Perhaps the most important friendship or hatred in the world right now is the friendship between Putin and Xi Jinping. I'm very concerned about this, and I think it's not something that the Trump administration has really focused on at all. I tried to focus on it with a CNN commentary a short time ago. It got some attention. But really, I think that is one of the most critical things to examine. These are two of the three major powers in the world, are China, Russia, and the United States, and they are now taking a solid front and a raid against the United States. This cannot be a good position for us to be in the long run, in my view.
No, it's you kind of wonder what's going on in back of the conference room and what they're giggling about and what they're plotting. But I am with you, my friend. Well, the gentleman is David A. Andelman, international correspondent. You can see him on CNN, read about him, and read his works in USA Today. And David, once again, an honor. Where else can our friends and fans follow you, and can you speak a moment on your books?
You can follow me on Twitter at David Andelman. My last book is Shattered Peace, Versailles 1919, and the Price We Pay Today is a new centennial edition out. It talks about all of the mistakes made back at the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I that we are paying for today all over the world, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, Eastern Europe. All of these mistakes that were made back then are coming home to roost. It's, I think, a riveting and exciting book. And I have a couple of other books coming along, which I will talk to you about on our next outing, hopefully.
And I'll be honored, and let us hope we're facing a better world than the one we are today, my friend. David, thank you so much. Thanks once again for being here, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Good night. And That was David Andelman, and I am so pleased to have him tonight. We're going to be coming right back, and we've got some great retromercials. The subject is the lovely ladies of the past, and you'll have some fun watching this. See you back in a moment.